Chances are you're watching this video on some kind of computer right now, whether it's a smartphone, a laptop, or even a smart TV. Now consider this. The very device you're using right now can be traced back to a single presentation. A presentation that took place in San Francisco on December 9th, 1968, by a man named Douglas Engelbart and his team. This groundbreaking presentation became known as the mother of all demos, and for good reason. Not just because it was the first of its kind, but because it shaped our daily lives for decades to come. How is that even possible? Simple. Engelbart and his team didn't just predict the future. They showed it to us, the future we're living in today. And they were spot on, decades ahead of their time. The mother of all demos laid it all out: the internet, the Mac, Windows, video conferencing, and countless other innovations that can be traced directly back to that single presentation, an astonishing 57 years ago. But it wasn't smooth sailing from there. Far from it. For nearly a decade, it seemed as if Engelbart's ideas had been lost, forgotten, until they were rediscovered almost by accident, gathering dust in the basement of one of the most powerful corporations of its time, only to be stolen, and then stolen again, sparking one of the greatest feuds in tech history. But before we get to that, let's first go back to December 9th, 1968, and see what actually happened. For context, here's what the most popular computer looked like in 1968. It was the size of a refrigerator, weighed 250 pounds, cost about $180,000 in today's dollars, and it was called the PDP-8. Using it? Well, that looked like this. No display, no mouse. If you wanted to program on the PDP-8, you had to use punch cards. You'd spend hours punching holes into cards, only to wait even longer to get your results. So you better not make mistakes. Because if you did, you'd have to start all over again. Punching holes, waiting hours, frustration building. Why am I telling you this? Because I want you to see just how difficult and frustrating computing was in the late 60s. The barrier to entry was sky high in both cost and skill. So how did a single presentation change everything? 2 words: understanding humans. Engelbart and his team understood something fundamental. For computers to reach their full potential, they had to work for humans, not against them. They got so many things right that the ideas presented in 1968 are still in use today. Not just by retro tech enthusiasts, but by regular people every single day. Let me give you an example. Before, the mother of all demos, the only way to interact with a computer was through punch cards or by typing cryptic commands on a keyboard without a screen. That was a problem. Engelbart's goal was to augment human intellect. But how could he do that if most people had no idea how to use a computer in the first place? The first step was to make computers less intimidating. In other words, he needed a better way for people to tell a computer what to do. So, along with engineer Bill English, he built a simple wooden prototype, a small handheld device with 2 perpendicular wheels, designed to move a cursor on a screen. Sound familiar? Of course it does. You've probably used one of these little gadgets before. Move it around, and a cursor moves in sync. Most people had never seen anything like it before Engelbart's demo in 1968. And that was just one of many game-changing innovations revealed that day. But for a long time, it seemed like Engelbart's vision would never become reality. A decade later, most engineers and entrepreneurs had never even heard of it. The ideas were collecting dust in a corporate basement, destined to be forgotten, until by pure luck they weren't. The mother of all demos was a spark. It ignited the imagination of an entire generation of engineers, programmers, and entrepreneurs. It showed them what computers needed to become before they could be useful to everyday people, before they could become a mass market product. But for Engelbart's vision to come to life, it had to take a few detours. The first stop? A research lab just 15 minutes away from where Engelbart and his team worked, on the other side of Stanford University's campus. That lab would go on to become legendary in its own right, Xerox Parc. You see, Xerox, the company behind it, was printing cash in the 60s, pun intended. They had just released the Xerox 914, a copier so successful that some called it the most profitable single product of all time. Revenue skyrocketed almost tenfold between 1961 and 1965, passing $500 million. Flush with cash, Xerox wanted to explore the future of technology beyond copiers. So, in 1970, they created Xerox Parc, a research center designed to attract the brightest minds. And just 2 years after Engelbart's demo, it's no surprise that many Parc researchers knew it by heart. It had left an impression, a big one. So they picked up where Engelbart left off, perfecting the graphical user interface, the computer mouse, and Ethernet networking. But there was a problem. Xerox had no idea what to do with these breakthroughs. Let me give you an example. The Parc team built one of the first personal computers, the Xerox Alto. It had all the cutting-edge technology they had been developing for years, but it cost $32,000. And that's in 80s dollars. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about a retail price of more than $130,000. In other words, Xerox never intended to mass produce it. They were in the copier business, and there was just too much money to be made selling copiers. Without any commercially viable products, Xerox Parc was a dead end. Engelbart's vision, still stuck in a Palo Alto basement. That is, until two ambitious young entrepreneurs, each from very different backgrounds, discovered what Xerox was hiding. One of them was Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs first visited Xerox Parc, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. In his words, it was like a veil being lifted. Larry Tesler, a Xerox engineer who gave Jobs a demo that day, recalled, "He watched for about a minute and started jumping around the room, shouting, 'Why aren't you doing anything with this? This is the greatest thing. This is revolutionary.'" But Jobs also realized something else. The race was on. If he could walk into that basement and stumble upon these ideas, who's to say someone else wouldn't? He had to act fast. So he cut a deal with Xerox. They could invest $1 million in Apple, and in return, he and his team could use any of Parc's ideas as they saw fit. Jobs wasted no time. He and his engineers documented everything they could. The thing that grabbed his attention the most, the graphical user interface, a way to make computers less intimidating, a friendly way to interact with them. It was the future of Apple. More than that, it was the future of the personal computer. But Jobs wasn't the only one paying attention. A man named Bill Gates was watching too. And what he did next would spark a rivalry that would last a lifetime. Steve Jobs wasn't the only one watching Xerox Parc's innovations closely. Bill Gates had also caught wind of what Jobs was working on, and he immediately understood that graphical user interfaces were the future. At the time, Microsoft was a pure software company, best known for MS-DOS, an operating system that required users to type commands to interact with their computers. It wasn't exactly user-friendly. So when Jobs invited Gates and his team to take a look at Apple's new Macintosh project built on ideas from Xerox Parc, Gates saw an opportunity. Microsoft had been developing software for the Mac, but Gates realized something important. Apple's graphical interface wasn't that different from what he had seen at Xerox Parc. And unlike Apple, Microsoft wasn't in the hardware business. So Gates made a bold decision. Instead of just building software for the Mac, He would create an entirely new operating system for IBM-compatible PCs, one that borrowed heavily from the Mac's graphical user interface. That operating system would be called Windows. Have a guess how Jobs reacted when he found out. Steve Jobs confronted Bill Gates, accusing him of stealing Apple's ideas, but Gates, never one to back down, had a sharp response. "Well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it." Jobs saw it differently. He viewed himself as an artist, a visionary, who had turned Xerox's raw ideas into something revolutionary. To him, Microsoft wasn't innovating, it was copying. But Gates wasn't trying to be an artist. He was trying to win, and with Windows, he did. Windows went on to become the dominant operating system, eventually outselling the Mac by a wide margin. Apple even sued Microsoft for copyright infringement, but the courts ruled in Microsoft's favor, stating that Apple itself had borrowed its ideas from Xerox. Jobs was devastated. His company was struggling, and he was eventually forced out of Apple in 1985. Meanwhile, Microsoft went on to become one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. So where does this leave Engelbart, the man who started it all? The one who envisioned a world where humans and computers work together seamlessly. He never became a billionaire. He never built a corporate empire. In fact, he spent much of his later life watching others get rich off of ideas he had demonstrated decades earlier. But despite that, his impact is undeniable. Many of those things we do on computers today, clicking, dragging, browsing the internet, video conferencing, were inspired by that 1968 presentation. Engelbart didn't just predict the future, he built it. And he shared it with the world. The rest? That was just a battle over who could commercialize his ideas best. So the next time you move your mouse, swipe your screen, or open a window on your computer, take a moment to remember the man who saw it all before most people did. Douglas Engelbart, the rich neighbor that lived next door to Xerox Parc,